All right, thanks everyone for being here. I hope this is useful. This is hopefully our first in a series of Werewolf changelog videos. So we're putting out a new release, Warewulf 4.6. We've put the first release candidate out. Let's see if I can get that displayed here. We'll show. And so yeah, just put this out last night. Oh, now I can't see myself anymore. That's probably a good thing. But there's a lot of changes in 4.6.0. And so one of the things we need to do for sure is have a really good release note or set of release notes for this, because there's going to be a lot of changes for people upgrading from 4.5.8 or a previous 4.5 release. But we've also put some tools out there that are meant to make that more straightforward than it's been in the past. So I want to demonstrate some of that to head off some of the problems that people have, and yeah, just make the transition as smooth as possible. Got some people in the chat here, so we'll be taking questions, but I'm also just kind of gonna casually go through this change log. There's what there is of release notes here on the front. We'll probably focus on some of these items here to talk about what's going on. But I'll keep a running tab on the left here that you can't see, both for what we're going to talk about next, especially for questions that come in, and you know, what I need to note in a future actual published release notes as we discover it. So one of the things that I've got, I'll increase my share here, is a home lab environment with two oh, now I've got Windows covering Windows. I've got two virtual machines with two different werewolf environments in it. This one, I've hopefully this is useful. I'll look at the chat to see if this is working well. But this one here that is blue, Werewolf Controller 1, is a Werewolf 4.5.8 environment. And so we can confirm that. I'm going to go ahead and become root for now. Hopefully. Yes, this is a 4.5.8-1. This is not a git checkout or anything. This is just 4.5.8. And then this is a 4.6.0 RC1 release. These are both installed from the RPMs that you can download from the releases page and installed just directly on these environments. So these are virtual machines that are running in this Proxmox environment. And I'll log into this real quick. So I have Werewolf Control 1, Werewolf Control 2, and then both are able to boot this Werewolf Node 1. And that may or may not be necessary at this point, depending on what we get into. This might all be console level stuff. But the first thing I want to show off is this Werewolf Control upgrade command. So this is a new command in 4.6.0. And the whole point of this, so every now and then when we make changes to Werewolf, we make changes to the data model, which means changes to the config files. So for people that are new to Werewolf, there's two main config files, and increasingly these are the only two. There's werewolf.conf, which is the configuration for the server itself. So this configures Werewolf, and then the DHCP, TFTP, and NFS services that that the Werewolf server runs. But then there's nodes.conf that I am personally increasingly referring to as the Werewolf registry, which includes node profiles and nodes. And this is where all the metadata for your nodes live. And this is mostly what changes. If we want to add something to this or change how it's formatted, people have to update this, and then when they upgrade and they don't know that they need to upgrade it, or if it just is a finicky thing, this is where things break, is when there are changes to this file. So we created this Werewolf Control upgrade command that the way it works is it can read any version of either of these files. And I went back all the way to the very beginning of the structures inside of Werewolf that define these. These should be able to ingest any werewolf.conf that has ever been valid and any nodes.conf that has ever been valid, and then tries to munge it into a version of those files that is correct for now. So I've already I've already run that on this server. So what I'm going to do is get those files from my previous version. So this is the werewolf.conf from 458. And I'll paste it in there, and then I'll do the same with nodes.conf. Oh, so I have those two files here. This is a werewolf.conf that is from 458 and a nodes.conf that is from 458. And we will run werewolf control upgrade. So there's two subcommands here. We can either upgrade config, which is that werewolf.conf, or nodes, which is the nodes.conf, and you do them separately. So we'll do the config first. We'll run help on here as well, because by default, it will try and just upgrade etc werewolfnodes.conf or werewolf.conf, whichever file, in place. And when it does that, it'll create a backup file. But that's not useful in this instance because we've already upgraded those files. So we're going to provide an input to werewolf.conf 458 and then output path. Again, normally it would just do it to etc werewolf.conf, but we are going to output it to standard out. I think this is the syntax that I assigned to that. Great. So we have some warnings here about things that are being ignored, and it has adjusted it, but we can't see those because it's just going right out. So instead, we're going to do this to werewolf.conf/460, and then we can compare them. Oh, wait, what? Well, first of all, I spelled it wrong. Um, do I need to say dot slash? That's weird. Well, there's a bug here. Maybe I haven't ever used this. The specifically the writing to a output file. I'll have to check on this. So we'll just send the standard out somewhere. What is this thing that I've created? Oh no. Well, we'll take a note for this. Let's just go to standard out and write it to something. There. There. So let's look at what it changed. And then maybe we'll use that as part of our uh, oh, it changed that file in place anyway. So now it's not changing anything. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have to figure out what's going on with the output file there. So we will come out here and regenerate this file so we can rerun that change and then see what it changes. So we're rerunning that again. We're upgrading our werewolf.conf 458 and writing it out to werewolf.conf 460. And then let's try our diff again. Oh, yeah. That's why it's happening, because here I'm not putting output path at all, whereas before I was sending it to output path um, standard out. So it's not producing any output. We'll do this one more time. I wonder if that means I'm overwriting the one that's in Etsy Werewolf. So yes, it's writing that out there. Okay. So let's take a note that if input path is specified, it should use that. If input path is specified, it should use that as the output by default, not the default location. Okay. It is trying to create backups when it does that. But I wonder where it's trying to write when I tell it to use an output path. And I'm not going to debug it right now, but all right, one more. All right, this is an old one already. Okay, great. Upgrade config, input path this, output path, standard out. There, now we have an updated version and we can look at what changed. So a little thing here, just the way the indentation is, that doesn't matter. Template moved. So we are not tracking this werewolf internal variable anymore. So the original intent of this was to version this file and then know, what version you were coming from and what version you were going to and what features were supported in that. But with this upgrade process and the way it works, the thinking is it doesn't matter what version people thought it was. This was never kept up to date, so this never matched what was actually in this file. So instead of worrying about this, we're just kind of fuzzily looking at the contents of the file and trying to make as much sense of it as possible. And that's going to end up being more robust than making assumptions about what's in the file based on the version that's specified. So another big thing that changed, and this is a little noisy here, so it might be harder to see, is that the NFS configuration in werewolf.conf used to specify the path that you're exporting and the options for that, but then also the options for mounting, whether it should be mounted, and whether it should be mounted. But the problem, so these settings were then global for the cluster. But what people tend to actually want to do is configure NFS mounts for individual nodes or for profiles within their cluster. And so we have moved NFS client mount options away from this single global configuration out to the same kind of configuration anywhere else. They're in the registry, they're in nodes.conf, and you can specify them on a profile or on individual nodes. So that ends up being much more flexible. So those are removed here. And then there should have been, oh, maybe because mount is false everywhere. If mount is ever true, then it says, hey, by the way, I'm stripping these mount options. You will need to incorporate them into your nodes.conf in order for them to still be mounted. Actually, let's do that. Let's demonstrate that. So if we were mounting home here, so we get a new warning that there was a legacy mount configured in werewolf.conf for shared. Was it shared? I thought I was changing home. Oh, I did change shared. Oh well. Anyway, so this used to be mounted on all nodes. In the future, when you run upgrade nodes, then you can specify this with werewolf.conf, and then the intent is like the backup file that came off of this upgrade, and it will read those mounts from the global configuration and add them to the default profile. You don't have to do that, but that's a way to bring those previous mount configurations into the nodes.conf. So I'm going to take a note that one of the things we should cover is NFS client configuration. All right, so let's upgrade a nodes.conf then. We already have one here. Well, actually, Make sure there weren't any more differences here. Yeah, this is just being removed. So one more thing. This is kind of an aside. Werewolf has historically, Werewolf 4 in particular, has historically referred to um, uh, the node images as containers, as part of almost like a political statement of containers are cool and Werewolf is part of the container ecosystem now. But we aren't running actual containers. We're just using containers for the images, or the container ecosystem for images. And it ends up causing more confusion than anything because people think that this means that they're running containers on their compute nodes and there might be a performance penalty or something like that. So we recently, relatively recently, took a poll of the community for what we should call this thing instead, and the win was images, and just go with it. So in the documentation, sometimes we say node images to differentiate, or OS images to differentiate from overlay images. But that nomenclature is passed here as well. So these are mounts that happen when you shell into an image using the command line. Um, and we have renamed it from container mounts to image mounts to match that new naming. I'll take another note here for demonstrating container versus node. Oh, yeah, I already had the container versus image, I mean. All right, so here's nodes.conf 458. This is the one that I was running on my 458 box before, and we will do werewolf control upgrade nodes, input, not input file. Oh, input path. Input path is nodes.conf 458. Output path is standard out. And so this is the first thing to be aware of. Um, you have to specify a Boolean value when doing this upgrade for add defaults and replace overlays. So this is because in the past, there were many default values that were just inherited by your werewolf cluster that came from somewhere else. Even earlier, they came from uh, just compiled in values inside of werewolf. More recently, they came from a defaults.conf that were stored somewhere, I think like in user share werewolf or something like that, that were not meant to be changed, just to try and get those out of the compiled in values. But now we make no assumptions about default settings, and instead we ship a nodes.conf that comes with those recommended defaults in the default profile. And since you're coming from an environment that may have assumed those settings, uh, you probably want to add those default settings into your default profile. But we don't want to assume that you want to do that in case you've already configured it some other way. So we require when you're doing an upgrade that you specify whether you want to add defaults or not. Because this is actually a kind of relatively base 458 image, let's actually show it here so I can see what's in here. Yeah, so this default profile is pretty empty, so we probably want those. So we're going to say add defaults true. And then replace overlays is because we have historically had just two main overlays that we ship, this generic overlay and then the ww init overlay, which isn't even shown here because it's coming in through those default settings. So those have been split out into many individual overlays for the specific parts of functionality that they're doing. So instead of a generic overlay, or I think these came in the WWNet overlay actually, but instead of one big overlay that tried to configure every network configuration system, now there's one for SUSE's Wicked. Now there's one for Network Manager. Now there's one for ifconfig, one for Debian network interfaces. And those are all broken out into different overlays. So I'm going to take a note here for the two different kinds of overlay split, and we'll get into that later. So there's functional and origin is how I'll put it in my notes. But this value here, replace overlays, is whether you want to replace references to generic and WWNet with the new values for those. And we require that you specify that explicitly as well. At least in this version, we're requiring that. So we will do that. And I've already specified an output path, so that should be good. Right. So we'll write that out to a file. So we have the same warning here that we're ignoring the stub internal. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to uh, also, oh, wait, what am I thinking? Oh, yeah, yeah. I was going to say with werewolf conf and provide that old werewolf conf so we can see it port the shared NFS mount into the default profile here. So um, it's warning us that test node 1 isn't including the default profile. That doesn't matter. It's just one that I created. But the reason this matters is that in the past, test node 1 still would have inherited some default settings from defaults.conf or from compiled in settings. But since it's not including the default profile, it isn't getting those. And we've only set defaults to the default profile. So this is something to be aware of. Might not matter in your environment, but it's letting you know just in case. So let's look at, or let's diff it, nodes.conf 458 and nodes.conf 460. So yeah, iPixie templates presumably just went somewhere else. Um, Oh, no, it's a default value. It used to be compiled in, it no longer is, so it's been added here. This is where we have replaced the generic runtime overlay with these three sub overlays. So now we configure, and these are what the generic overlay was doing before, but now it's explicit. We're configuring Etsy hosts, we're configuring authorized keys for SSH, and we're configuring sync user. And the big win here is now you can omit, you can remove any one of these, and it's a little bit more straightforward to do that without having to modify the built-in overlays. Same thing for the system overlay, or it wasn't specified at all before because we were just inheriting the www overlay before, but now we enumerate them on default and they're broken out. So we have werewolf init, werewolf client, we configure fs tab, which is now where we're configuring NFS mounts. We kind of were before too, but it wasn't configured the same way. We have the host name, host keys. Oh yeah, the host keys for that could probably be moved in. Oh wait, the system overlay, right? We configured the SSH host keys in the system overlay. Configure Etsy issue. These are all here because these are what that overlay was doing before. In the future, we won't just automatically include all of the overlays that we build by default with the system. This also enables us to ship more overlays, maybe in different packages, maybe in the same package, and it's a little bit more straightforward to kind of swap these out. So once you've done an upgrade like this, you probably just want to identify the one network configuration system that you're using, like maybe you're using Network Manager, and you want to remove ifconfig and Debian interfaces and Wicked. And I feel like there's one more in here, but I'm not seeing it right now. Maybe that is all of them. So that you're only distributing the files that you actually need. This is another thing that was coming in by default. The default kernel args, we now specify that explicitly. And then you can see here, and we'll talk about this more, though I don't have it in my notes, that kernel arguments are now a list rather than it used to be a flat string. This is the big win here is that you can now have kernel arguments come from different profiles in the node and then they mix together rather than having to constantly redefine that whole string. Default value of init is now specified, although interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check on this. This must have been what it was setting before. This must be what werewolf init runs after it runs. Default root value. So resources is new, and we will talk about this at the same time as NFS client configuration, but this is a new facility for doing arbitrary YAML configuration in this file. So fs tab here is a thing being read by the fs tab overlay, but the structure of this fs tab resource is not defined in Werewolf code anywhere. It is implicitly expected by that overlay, but you don't have to modify Werewolf in order to define what data structure in here you want. So this will add a lot of flexibility to the ability to make really dynamic overlays. I'm pretty excited about it. Um, Profile 1 doesn't have runtime overlay 1. Maybe maybe because overlay 1 doesn't exist. I'm going to put a note about that. It's not removing the entire uh, runtime overlay because it's retained here in runtime overlay for profile 2. Oh wait, profile 2 got moved and it still has it. Oh, I see what's going on. This runtime overlay became this runtime overlay because profile 2 is moving. It's just the diff being weird. So it's just changing the indentation here. That's all that's going on. So I'll erase my comment of worry. Down here in nodes, what happened to test node? Test node moved from the bottom to the top just for whatever reason because of the way the hash ordered it. But that looks like it's still the same. Yeah, it's still the same. What changed in here? The format of kernel args. So yeah, we were specifying kernel args on this node, and it changed it from this string to this list of args, which is what we want. We added a default Ethernet type to this network interface because that's no longer assumed. And I think that's everything. Yeah, so that mostly worked. And my phone is blowing up, so I'm going to check on that just in case there's something going on. Ah, okay. Unrelated, not work related. All right, so that's mostly Werewolf upgrade. We have taken one note for release notes, which is that the output file isn't working. And then I also will want to describe the required arguments for nodes and why they are required and talk about that. Oh, and another note that if we specify an input path, we should use that output by default. Okay, great. So the next thing I have on the list is tabular output, which is kind of um, a nothing issue, but it also caused a lot of problems. So let's look at werewolf control node list minus a, which is kind of a common command that people run. We've got a lot of issues with our tabular output here. So what's going on is this rightmost value is as long for everyone as this, but that means, so this here is, this kernel args line is saying how long this value is, or maybe there's an even longer one somewhere. Oh yeah, but that means that this field is as long as that for everyone, including the heading. And it is actually putting white space here, which causes all kinds of wrapping issues. And if you try and write this out to a file or parse it, it just makes all this output ugly. Oh, cool. So we have replaced the library that's generating this output with a different library. Which library it is, doesn't matter. You can look at the code if you want. But let's look at what this looks like out here. So we still have wrapping sometimes, especially for these long overlay lists, but it no longer is padding this output with extra white space, which just ends up looking ugly and not being what people expect. So the reason this was happening is this library was meant to produce output not quite like this, but kind of encased in cells, kind of like a spreadsheet. And we were just kind of munging this library to not show the borders of the cells, but you still got artifacting. Like over here, there's white space. That's because this, oh, there, this character here is supposed to be like the outline of it. And that's why I'm thinking now, that's why there's extra white space here because, or even here, because it's trying to draw the outside border of this cell. So we've replaced that all, and now we have just more reasonably expected tabular output for all of the werewolf control commands is used in common through all of those. All right, so that's two. let's talk about resources. So resources are, as I mentioned before, a way to configure uh, nodes.conf data arbitrarily. So do I have a mount in here? I don't. Okay, well, we'll look at the one I just upgraded then. Not old. So yeah, here we go. Resources. So this resources thing exists for both nodes and profiles. You can define it anywhere. Not on individual network interfaces, though. This is a node level or profile level definition, and it is in Go in within Werewolf. This resources is a map, which means like a hash, right? A hash table, a map of strings to anything. And so what this one here is, just by how we've defined it, is a map of strings. So the string is fs tab, a map of names to a list of maps. So each item in this list is a mount point. And this is defining how we want mounts in fs tab here to be mounted. So we're automatically porting, I say automatically, we provide functionality in Werewolf Upgrade to convert client NFS mounts from the werewolf.conf file into this resources format, but it's more flexible than that. You can actually put any mount that you want in here, and it will go into the FS tab that's generated, not just an NFS mount. Though we do default VFS type to NFS because of that history and the likelihood that if you're mounting something in here, it's probably an NFS mount. But it can be like a local ext4 or XFS or whatever. You can do NFS v4. And the names in here might seem a little odd, but they are the same names that are used in the man page for FS tab. Um, so yeah, they're spec and is it above this or yeah, spec and file and VFS type. So that's where that's coming from. So we can go look at the FS tab overlay to see how that's implemented because you can use these same kinds of resources when defining your own overlays. So this is going through all of the entries in that FS tab. Entry is just a variable name, but we have our FS tab thing, which was gotten from the resources. So we extract our FS tab resource, and then we look over all of the entries for that resource, and then index into it to get spec and the file and with a default NFS, whatever the VFS type is, and all of the things. And then there are other defaults here for, these two numbers that go at the end of your mount. They default to 0, so you don't have to specify them. And we also default options to defaults if you don't specify those as well, but you can overwrite that. So you can control everything about how this FS tab entry is written with a resource in your nodes.conf. And again, because it's defined in nodes.conf, it can be mixed and matched. So you can put one mount in a profile and then more mounts in your nodes, and then they will just append to each other. What you can't do because of the way it mixes together the lists, the items in the list, the thing that's doing the merging doesn't know if you have the same mount specified in two places. So you'll end up with the same mount specified twice. So you can't like create a home mount in a profile and then change its settings on a node because you'll just get a new mount with those new settings. But you can have different mounts in different places and it will cat them together. So let's look and see what this looks like here. We can say render. Uh, this is my actual test node. Oh, this one doesn't have that. Oh, right, because this this is the real one, not my test file. So let's see. Let's copy that value from here into my actual nodes.conf. And here's werewolf node 1. and we will add resources into it. So we're adding that mount, and now we can render and we see that it's mounting from the Warewulf server, which we can depend on as long as we have the hosts overlay in our system. Warewulf should be defined as where the Warewulf server is. So we're mounting from the Warewulf server this /shared mount, which we defined usually in the werewolf.conf. So the server is exporting that. We're mounting it at /shared, which no longer has to be the same value as where it's being exported from with an NFS mount and these default settings. I'll go ahead and remove that because that's not actually being exported by this server. So we've gone over resources and NFS client configuration. For the chat, if there's anything that you have seen in the changelog that you're wanting to get more information about, feel free to put it in there, and I'd be happy to focus on the features or fixes or changes or anything that you're particularly interested in. Otherwise, I'll just keep going through it. So we talked about the overlay split. So there's two big changes to overlays. Oh, this isn't where I want. Here we go. There's two big changes to overlays. One is that there used to be just two main overlays, generic and WW init. Now you have them split out into all of the things that they were doing. So that makes this overlay interface make a lot more sense. Actually, the whole point of this, we have one here. There. That's what it used to look like. And this is even more than there were because I had defined a few test ones, but mostly it was this www init that had 60 files in it, and then this generic one. So now that's split out into all of these. But there's another major change to overlays, and that is that we've split the overlays into what we call site overlays and distribution overlays. This should probably say like origin and then whether and then site or distribution. But for now, it's just whether it is a site overlay. And the idea here is to make it easier to keep your overlays, the ones that you write, separate from the overlays that we distribute with the product. So now the default location for overlays is in, well, if you install from the packages, is in user share Warewulf overlays. And that's where all of these overlays, because none of them are site overlays, that's where they are all from. But if you make a change to any of these, so let's say we want to change the issue message, and we come in here and we want to, I don't know, we change the issue. Uh-oh. Well, this is a mistake. Found another bug. What did it actually do? Did it make it? Okay, I see. So what it's meant to do is copy it over here, but it didn't because it didn't create this overlays directory before it tried to make issue. So we will fix that. But now that I've made this issue or this overlays directory, let's do this edit again and try this again. Okay, and now it's fine. If I look at my overlay list now, I see that issue is listed twice, which is interesting. But it's showing up as a site overlay instead of what we refer to as a distribution overlay. So there's another bug, which is that site overlays show up twice in the list. And this is happening because it finds it as a distribution overlay, but then it shows it to you as a site overlay because we always prefer the one you have locally at your site over the distribution one, but it's just not knowing that it shouldn't try to show the distribution overlay. So what this means, in the place you've historically managed overlays, in varlib Warewulf overlays, we now have an issue. So when you make any change to an overlay, it copies the or to a distribution overlay. It copies the entire overlay over to the site location, the site local location that we will no longer be removing when we uninstall Werewolf, let's say, or upgrade Werewolf. These overlays shouldn't be disrupted in the future. Uh, and then record your changes there. So this is my awesome cluster. And then anytime the system asks for the issue overlay, it will get your site one instead of the distribution overlay. So this lets you override the system overlays with a local version without having to actually modify the one that we ship. And that way, when we ship a new version of that overlay or you upgrade Werewolf, it won't replace your changes. Your changes will persist. Now, the downside to that is that if there's some change to overlays or the metadata that's made available to them, your site overlays could break. We try to make the interface that we present to overlay templates robust and backwards compatible, but that might not always be the case. There may be breaks there. So if you upgrade and your site overlays break, you can always compare what you have to what's in the distribution overlay now with something like, let's see, share Werewolf overlays issue rootfs etc issue dub. Uh, and so you could do this to see how your overlay compares to the one that we're shipping with the version you just upgraded to. And that should call out any functional differences that might be why your overlay is breaking. So that's a thing that we're hopeful will open the door to redistributable overlays in the future. Like you may or may not be aware, one of the steering committee members, Grisnog, John Hanks, has a huge collection of overlays that he manages for his site that are just up on GitHub. Now that we can separate the overlays that we distribute from site overlays, we're hoping to make it easier to package those up and share them out and install them without having to worry about interplay and interaction with the distribution overlays. And you can turn them individually on and off. All right, so we've been through both of these overlay splits. All right, this is one of the larger changes, but is probably an easier thing to demonstrate than a lot of the others. I mentioned earlier, we have renamed containers to images. So in the past, when you said Werewolf control container list, let's say, and you got a list of what we were calling containers, now in 4.6.0 image list, I guess, you get a list of images. This was one of the more disruptive changes, as you might expect, changing this name not just in the interface, but all the code, but it all seems to have gone relatively well. One thing that we have done, though, is try and maintain aliases. So if your muscle memory already says containers, you should, or container, you should be able to say Werewolf control, hopefully, container list, and that still works. And you still get image name, but that still works. And then if you say Werewolf control node set, we'll set on test node 1. I don't know if I actually have a Rocky Linux 8. Oh no. Okay, it must have just been container, not container name. So node 1 or test node 1 is wrong. So let's see, what else do I have in here? I know, whatever. I'll just actually change Werewolf node 1. So I still get, you can still specify it as container in here, but you can also specify it as image. We talked about it earlier in the demo, but we have changed how kernel arguments are listed. So in the past, let's look at c warewolfnodes.conf. So in the past, you could specify kernel arguments, and it was just this big long string. And the big problem with this is that you couldn't just add arguments to the kernel argument list. You couldn't specify a set of default arguments in a profile and then additional arguments in a node. You always had to redefine this entire string. So now kernel arguments are a list and it behaves, well, let's see. So we have kernel args, that's in default. Um, let's add like no splash to default. So we have kernel args here is quiet and crash kernel. And what happens if well, first of all, what argument actually is here? What? Oh my. I have accidentally told it to print. What has happened? There we go. So kernel args is just asking for a string. Hopefully this works. I'm realizing I may not have ever actually set the kernel args list from the command line. So let's see. Profile set default, kernel args to, and let's see, what was it before? Uh, quiet crash kernel and no splash. And our kernel args are quiet crash kernel no splash, and let's make sure that it actually got set as a list. Great. So we've set that on default, but then we have, do we have other arguments here? Yeah, we have other arguments on our node. And we see that the node is getting quiet crash kernel, no splash, and the settings that were on the node. So again, the goal here is just to make it easier to aggregate settings from profiles to nodes. Can we show the rendered file? Yeah, so mostly this renders out to ipixie dot or default.ipixie or dracket.ipixie or the grub config. That's a little bit harder to render. Let me see. Let me see. Maybe I can do that. No, it's Werewolf D and then curl. Nope. So I want, what's the port? I can never remember this port. 9873. And then curl localhost. Okay, so we're getting that, and then it's like iPixie, and then I think the MAC address of the node. I guess I can find it in the file if this doesn't work. Um, let's look in the um, let's see. iPixie, and then and I shouldn't need any of the rest of these. There we go. So this is how it gets rendered, or at least one of the ways in which it gets rendered for that node, and it's getting the arguments as expected. Quiet, crash kernel, no splash. They're just joined together with a space. But you can also see it in Etsy issue. So but this isn't as functional. Um, we can render what? Oh, not Etsy FS tab. Etsy issue. So we happen to also show the kernel args in the Etsy issue file, and they are joined here the same way. All right. So we've shown the kernel argument list. Here also is one of the bigger things in Werewolf 4.6.0, and that is that we've completely changed the way kernel. I'm not actually using this screen back here, so let's stop sharing that. Maybe make these a little bit bigger. We've completely changed how we are allowing you to select, or we're changing kernel management in general. So in the past, there was a whole kernel subsystem. We can say werewolf control kernel, and you could import individual kernels into the system. You could list kernels. I don't know if I have any. Uh, okay, I do have one. And then, delete them if you've imported them. The idea here at first was that a kernel would be something managed separately from the image. And usually what you would do is import this kernel from the Werewolf server, the Werewolf host, into Werewolf itself, and then you could serve that kernel out. There are two problems with that. First is that it implicitly ties the version of the operating system and the operating itself that you run on the Werewolf server with what you're running out on your nodes. So it assumes that there's at least some compatibility between those. We don't necessarily want that to be the case. We want you to be able to run Rocky Linux on the server and Debian on the compute nodes, or vice versa. The other problem with that is that it's not enough just to have a kernel. You also need all of the modules. So it means uh, compiling all of the kernel modules into a .img, similar to how we do the node image itself and the overlay images. And then you had to ship that out when the node is booting and place it on the file system or in a way that the kernel could find while the kernel was booting. And that was really what ended up causing the most problems. So after the original creation of this kernel system, uh, Werewolf added the ability to import kernels from the container image or node image directly. So you could kernel import. Like by default, it wants to import the kernel from the host, but you could also say, I want to import a kernel from a container, an image, and it would try and bring that kernel into Werewolf from an arbitrary image. But getting the kernel, uh, getting the kernel modules from that image, wherever they happened to be, and building an image that would be distributable to any arbitrary kernel, or sorry, any arbitrary node that's booting with an operating system, just was a lot of trouble. So after that, once we knew how to find at least the kernel in the image, we gained the ability to just not use a kernel at all in terms of this explicit sense and find a kernel in the image that you are booting and auto detect that kernel. There were little issues still, where if you had more than one kernel in your image, then it might not find the right version because it didn't know how to order the multiple packages correctly and extract the most recent one by default. And then if for some reason you wanted to specify an explicit kernel, we didn't have a facility for doing that without going through this whole process of importing it into Werewolf and specifying it. And this mostly just caused problems for people. I can't say how many of the help requests we get in Slack are people encountering this system in like the quick start and thinking that they have to do it and just saying skip that step and suddenly everything works. So what we have done is we've gotten rid of all of this kernel import functionality. You can no longer import kernels into Werewolf. This kernel command still exists though. Or no, now it's container or not container, it's image kernel. Because now what we're doing is explicitly showing you what kernels exist in a given image. And this output is a bit wide because of the kernel paths. But now we explicitly can see uh, that there are two kernels in this Rocky Linux 9 um, container, and we can see which kernels are in each of these containers. And or I'm saying containers now, still image, which kernels are in each of these images. We can also see, or we can set, sorry, we can, let's say, what are we using as the default image for the default profile? Are we not specifying one at all? We aren't specifying one at all. So let's do that. Let's say, so now maybe that was the issue. Maybe it just wasn't grepping for capital I. But we are defining the default image as Rocky Linux 9. And we know that, not image list, image kernels. We know that the default kernel for that image is this one. This is the one that it will pick up and use, and it's being a little bit more intelligent than it was before about detecting the most recent one. And we found some library that lets us do version comparisons. So we're trying to find the most recent one that isn't a debug or something like that kernel. And but let's say that we want to specify this one explicitly. We want to boot this kernel with by default instead of the most recent one. I can say www.ctl profile set default kernel version, and I can set it to 5.14.0, and you'll see this is actually tab completing to the kernel versions that are in the container that is set, or in the image that is set on this profile. So we are 5.14.0.427, and we want to boot this 37 kernel by default. Or if we want to specify, like maybe there are multiple builds, like maybe a debug build and a regular build of that kernel on the same image, we can also specify it by an explicit path. So we can say libmodules 427 37 and say that we want to boot that literal actual kernel file. So this, I'm hoping, will simplify just a lot of kernel management issues that a lot of people have been having when they're first getting started with Warewulf, or if they're the kind of site that installs an image and then shells into it to make changes and upgrades and installs new kernels. This should behave much more naturally and give you a lot more control over what Warewulf will do with an image when additional kernel packages show up. By default, it'll do what you probably expect. It'll start booting into the most recent kernel that it finds. And that detection is done at boot time. So you don't even need to rebuild your overlays to get that to happen. But you can also specify a specific version. And then if your system boots and there's a newer kernel, but you've said, please boot that older one, it will just keep booting that older kernel as long as it exists. If it has been removed from the image, then you'll get an error message in the log saying it can't find a kernel of that version. But again, that should be a little bit more natural. All right, so that is everything I've already pulled out. Let's look through. Let's actually add this share back in and look through the changelog for anything else that we should go over. Let's look here. Sprig. Sprig's really cool. So Warewulf templates in the overlays are Golang text templates. So let's reduce this file again. And is this one bigger than it should be also? No, it's shorter. Oh my. So let's see. Let's look at the FS tab overlay. So yeah, because this is one where we're using a sprig function. So Werewolf overlay templates that end in .dub, these are what let you have the werewolf overlays be kind of dynamically generated based on the metadata in your cluster. And so we have kind of Golang primitives of, we can say width and range and loop over things. And I think index is also a primitive. But often there's a lot of functionality you might want when generating a template that is not immediately available. The list of functions that are available to text template is it's pretty minimal, and you can specify additional functions and just provide them. We can, the Werewolf developers can define new functions and provide them, but that's a very call and response kind of thing. And there's a lot of just basic functionality that, as more and more people want to make custom templates, maybe they don't want to wait for us to define every little thing that they might want to do. So, a member of the steering committee, I think this was Grisnog as well, found Sprig, which is a set of um, just basic useful text template functions to manipulate strings and do math stuff and manipulate lists and all of these things, just very useful little bits of functionality. So now we import the entire library of Sprig functions and make them available to Werewolf text templates. So again, this should just make it a lot easier to make really good, really concise, and um, easy to follow overlays. So, and I think an example here, I'm pretty sure this defaults function is coming from Sprig. So I didn't have to implement the logic of if this value is null, then give defaults, otherwise give this value. I was just able to do it with this function. So for if you develop your own overlays, if you are thinking about developing your own overlays, look through this function list. There's a lot of really useful stuff in here that just simplifies the process. All right, let's see what else. So we talked about that. Oh, yeah. So I am a little bit worried that this is not as pervasively uh, available as I would like it to be, but let's see. So if, we have added, in theory, the ability to output from Werewolf control as YAML and JSON. So the most obvious one is node list. Well, we'll just show it. This is what it looks like, and minus A actually probably. But output, is it output? Let's look at the help output for this. Oh, right, we added it. It wouldn't be here. Okay, so we just said out JSON and output, so it's not output equals either of these. So now we can say node list JSON. Great, and we get the metadata for the nodes that are in your cluster as a JSON formatted data structure, and then same for YAML. So this is just new functionality that we did not have before. Okay, so we talked about Sprig, upgrade, kernels. Oh, yes, nested profiles. Let's talk about nested profiles. This is something that, again, a member of the steering committee was asking for, that I was pretty afraid of, but it kind of went in reasonably well. And in implementing it, we fixed a number of bugs anyway. So that was good. So let's stop sharing this. Well, no, we'll keep it. So let's see if I have any right now. No. So historically, what you've had in this nodes registry is you've had profiles, and there are node profiles up here, and then nodes. And nodes can have one or more profiles. So profiles is a list, and you could inherit from multiple profiles, and then the rightmost profile, if there was the same setting in multiple profiles, that it was an override style setting, then the rightmost one would win. If it was a list, then it would just add up the values from all of them left to right. It would just concatenate to them. And then you would end up with a final value in your node. But what we have now is the ability to have profiles in a profile. So let's show what that looks like. So do I have comments here? Yeah, what man, let's think of a reason I would want to do this. Okay, so we have our default profile, and then let's say that we have this other profile and we'll call it cluster. Um, and it has a comment that so we have some default settings up here. We don't want to change the defaults for whatever reason. And instead, we're going to put settings in the cluster itself. And we put a comment here saying that we're getting those settings from the actual cluster. And then this, uh, so in the past, you could have done something like this by just having the node inherit from the two profiles in order. So it would be default and then cluster. But now you can say profiles on your cluster profile, and it inherits from default. Uh, and we'll get rid of this because I don't know what's in that runtime overlay. So now, instead of saying default cluster, you can just say that this node gets from cluster. And even though we're only inheriting from cluster, we're still getting settings from default. And then here, kernel args, it's getting it from default and the node because it's getting settings from those two places. But then where's comment? Oh, it's still getting comment from default. Interesting. Oh, well, no. Actually, I'm confused by that. That might be a bug. So let me think about this. So it should have. Okay, yeah, I see this. So it would work for lists, I think, but okay. Well, here's another possible bug. That it looks like the final profile that's inheriting from other profiles does not itself then override the settings in the profiles it's inheriting from. Let me make sure I actually put comment in there properly. So, yep, it's still there. So this comment should win out against this default profile. So that looks like a bug. Another one to add to the list. Talked about resources, talked about NFS, talked about split overlays and defaults, the tabular output. Oh yeah, here's another thing. Um, so as we've kind of discussed, lots of the functionality in Werewolf comes from overlays. And those overlays are built into overlay images, a runtime overlay image and a system overlay image that are applied to the file system at different times. But in order to update your nodes from the contents of the overlays that you write, you need to rebuild those images. So you can do that with just overlay build, which will by default build all the overlays for all the overlay images for all the nodes. So we have a runtime one and system one here. And then I think this is because we have node one and oh yeah, this is just building and compressing. That's why I'm seeing it twice. But for large sites that have many nodes, this becomes a performance bottleneck because it was building these one at a time. So we've had some recommendations to parallelize this with GNU Parallel, but now we are building transparently using threads inside of the application, inside of Werewolf control. And I think, yeah, you can specify how many workers that you want to use. By default, it says 8 here, but I think that's because I have an 8-core CPU. Yeah. Um, by default, it will use as many workers as it has threads available. So we can see this now. Let's, This, okay, so we've added 100 nodes over there. And then let's see if this works the way I want. Yeah, so I've added 100 nodes over here, and we're just going to see what happens. We say overlay build. So this is what it looks like before. It builds them one at a time. And over here, it's building them vastly in parallel. So these are both virtual machines, but they're virtual machines on the same system uh, with the same resources available. And, you can just tell this one on the right going a lot faster. We're almost done on the right. So we've completely built all 100 nodes overlays over there, and over here we're up to node 39. So, and frankly, my test system here is pretty low resource, so that should be an even better experience in a modern cluster. All right, let's see what else. Networking functionality. Yeah, we've fixed the way, so we added the ability to have static routes and VLANs now. So let's see what that looks like. It might be easier to just look at in the docs. Docs main and let's see, VLAN. I bet that'll. So yeah, you can now specify VLANs using node tags, and that's it's not node tags, using network interface tags, network tags. You can set a VLAN ID and then a parent device for VLAN interfaces, and that is supported, I think, in all of the network systems. And then something very similar for static routes. You can add a tag for you just name the route and then give a route here. And again, I think this is supported in all of the network overlays that we support. But we also fixed bonding. So I don't have command line here for this for whatever reason, but um, there were instructions here for creating a network bond before that made a lot of implicit assumptions on how you would name your interfaces. But with resources, this is a lot more straightforward. Or is it resources? No, it's just tags, using network tags for this. So now we can just say that EN1 and EN2 are both, they both have a master interface, this bond 0, and then bond 0 is a bond that has the actual interfaces on it. And this behaves correctly, at least in the network manager and if config systems. I don't think that the Debian and Wicked systems have been updated to support this yet, but it should be relatively straightforward to do so if it is needed. But it's also, with this example, I think it would be pretty easy to set up any bond that you needed yourself in an overlay too. Kernel arguments is a list. Oh, the non-zero exit codes on errors. Let's see. So before, like, let's say that we were over here and we ran, this is finished now, but dub control node set, um, well, let's say T1, one of our new test nodes. We'll set its profile to not a real profile. Oh, it is gonna let me do that. So what's something that would exit 0 or non-zero that would give an error? Let's think about it. I don't know. This is going to be difficult to demonstrate, but it's a small thing anyway. In the past, when these systems exited non-zero, oh, you know what? We can see in the changelog because some of these are specifically called out. Um, Container copy failure. Um, Yeah, some of these are just when there was a failure. Anyway, they were still returning 0, so it was difficult to know when there was a failure, but now they're returning non-zero in those. Ah, here's a small thing that I'm pretty happy about. So in the past, if you wanted to run a command in one of these, So you had to specify this dash dash twice. So if we said this, we would get an error, and you ended up having to do this, which was, oh, no, it's still giving an error. What is going on here? The user bin? No. Oh, wait, command. I'm not reading the error. This is the problem when about building too. Can I control see that? I can. Excellent. Oh, but I wonder if that left that behind. So, okay. In the past, if you wanted to run a command in there, this is what you would expect to work, but it didn't. So you'll see that there's no kind of hello world in here. Oh no, it is. What? Interesting. Maybe it's that you couldn't specify flags. So maybe, yeah, there we go. Because the way it's parsing this subcommand, it doesn't understand that this needs to be passed through again. So in order to get this to work, you had to have two of these, which is not what anyone expects. But we've fixed that over here now. So this is relatively normal. This just doing it once is saying, "Hey, werewolf control image exec. If you see flags to the right of this, they are regular arguments. Don't interpret them as flags for yourself." But now that is all that is necessary in order to. Oh, has. I didn't say which image. Let's say leap 15. Why not? Image exec. There. Got it right that time. And so now we can see the package list there, and we didn't have to know this weird Baroque, like put the hyphen hyphen twice. So that's taken care of. But that has brought to my attention a simpler thing that is also good to know. So in the past, if you wanted to skip building either when you exited a shell or when you ran an exec, you had to exit non-zero. Exiting non-zero does um, uh, still does skip building because it thinks if the command exited with an error, maybe there's a thing we want to clean up, we won't automatically build. But you can now specify build false, and it just won't. Oh, what's wrong? Oh, yeah, run directory already exists because I control C'd it. So now you can run commands in here without doing a build. Maybe we should skip the exit script too. I won't make that change for now, but it might be a good idea to skip the exit command when you do build false or create a different argument for it or something like that. All right, let's go back out here. So that's everything that was at the top of the list, and we've been doing this for like 90 minutes now. I'll check in with chat again and see if there's anything that I didn't cover that you'd like to see right now. All right. Well, thank you so much for either being here while I've gone through these features or for watching later. I hope it is useful. If you do have any questions, please do come find us on Slack. You can get that. Well, I think the invite is actually out of date right now. Um, but it should be fixed at werewolf.org/help. Um, to join the Slack, find us on GitHub. My name is Jonathan, and you can find me at janderson@ciq.com. Let's put that here so you can find me at janderson@ciq.com. If you have any questions or feedback on this or would like to see anything else in a later video or recording, we're going to keep working on the 4.6.0 release for sure. We found a few bugs here today. There are definitely a few more. So, oh, not here. So if we go to Werewolf, not Werewolf, GitHub, Werewolf issues and filter by the 460 milestone and then specifically bugs, which are probably what will be prioritized before the release is done. These are things that we are aware of and tracking. I'd like to get as many of these in to 460 before a final release, but if you find your own issues while testing the release candidate, please feel free to submit them here, and we'll look forward to that. Until then, thanks again for being here, and we'll talk to you later.